picture a small plane in the autumn of 1930, drifting low over the flat pine woods of eastern North Carolina, its single engine humming a steady tune against the morning sky. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The pilot in that cockpit was carrying a camera, doing routine survey work for the state, and he had no idea that the photographs in his lap would change how people saw their own backyard forever. From the ground, the land below looked like any other stretch of southern country. Long-leaf pines stood in patient rows. Black water ran slow through cypress swamps. Cotton fields and tobacco barns sat tucked between sandy roads. A farmer walking these woods would never have seen what the pilot saw. The trees grew too thick. The ground rolled too gently. The shapes were too wide to notice, with 2 feet planted in the dirt. But up there, at 10,000 feet, the land told a different story. The pictures came back from the developing room a few days later, and the men who spread them across a wooden table fell silent. Across the prints, scattered like raindrops on glass, were thousands of perfect ovals. Hundreds of thousands, maybe, each one shallow, each one shaped like an almond or a great sleeping eye, and every single one tilted the same way, pointing its long edge toward the northwest, as if some unseen hand had pressed them all into the earth with the very same gesture. These shapes had a name already. The locals called them bays, not because they held water, though many of them did, but because of the Sweet Bay and Loblolly Bay trees that grew thick inside their muddy bottoms. Settlers had known about the bays for 200 years. The PD and the Catawba and the Lumbee had known about them far longer than that, and they had stories of their own. But nobody, in all those generations of walking and farming and hunting and telling tales, had ever guessed at the bigger picture. Nobody had seen the pattern. From the air, the pattern was impossible to miss. The bays stretched from southern New Jersey all the way down to northern Florida. They covered the coastal plain of the Carolinas like footprints left by some enormous walker. Some were tiny, no bigger than a backyard. Others were giants, miles across, deep enough to hold whole lakes inside their gentle walls. And in every state, in every county, in every soggy patch of ground, the ovals pointed the same direction, toward the northwest, toward something, toward nothing. Nobody knew. That single fact is what makes the Carolina Bays one of the strangest puzzles in American soil. Rivers wander, hills rise and fall, lakes form where the land allows. None of those ordinary things explain 500,000 matching shapes lined up like fish scales across 6 states. Something made them. Something gave them their shape. Something pointed them all toward the same far horizon. And almost 100 years after that pilot brought his photographs home, no one can say for certain what that something was. There are theories, of course. Some of them are gentle. Some of them are wild. One says the wind shaped the bays slowly. Over thousands of cold and patient years, scouring sand into ovals while shallow water sat inside them. Another says a comet broke apart over North America at the end of the last ice age, raining icy chunks down across the coast, leaving these soft scars behind. A third points to ancient lakes, dried up and reshaped by gusts off a different climate, when mammoths still walked the southern pines. Each theory has believers. Each theory has problems. Each theory leaves a little corner of the mystery untouched. And the bays themselves keep their secrets well. They hold dark water the color of black tea. They grow strange plants that live nowhere else on Earth. They shelter fish found only inside their banks, frogs that sing only in their muck, and old peat layers thick as quilts, where the past lies pressed and waiting to stand at the edge of a Carolina bay at dusk, with the cypress knees rising like little crowns from the still water, is to stand at the edge of a question older than any town, any road, any name on the map. The pilot in 1930 had no idea what he had found. Neither do we, not really. The bays are still there, sleeping under the pines, pointing the same way they always have. And the story of how they got there is only just beginning. Picture the Carolinas in the early days of the 1930s. The country is deep in hard times. Banks have closed. Crops have failed. Out in the long, flat country between the Appalachian foothills and the Atlantic shore, The land lies quiet under a soft southern sky. Tobacco barns lean in the fields. Cotton stands in low white rows. Sharecropper houses sit on cinder blocks under tall pines, their tin roofs ticking in the afternoon heat. This is a slow country, a country of red clay roads and cypress swamps, a country where the air smells like wet pine bark in the morning and warm tar by noon. In the small towns, men in suspenders and straw hats walk the wooden boardwalks. Women in cotton dresses fan themselves on porches lit by kerosene lamps. The radio sits in the front room like a small wooden god. Mules still pull plows in the back fields. The world here moves at the pace of a slow river. Above it all, a new sound has begun to hum across the sky. The sound of small airplanes, open cockpit biplanes with wood frames and canvas wings, mail planes from the airfields outside Raleigh, crop dusters with goggles fogged by morning mist, surveyors with bulky cameras strapped to wing struts, sent out by the federal government to map the southern coastal plain for the first time from the air. The pilots wore leather helmets and long scarves. Their cockpits smelled of engine oil and pipe tobacco. Below them, the land rolled out like a quilt stitched by a tired hand. Pine forest, black water creeks, corn fields cut into squares, long stretches of moccasin, that soft, spongy swampland the locals called the trembling earth, where a man could sink to his knees in moss and never touch hard ground. For most of these flights, the view was just the green, endless carpet of the South. But every so often, when the light was right, a pilot would glance down and see something that stopped him cold. Ovals, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Soft, shallow bowls pressed into the land like a giant had laid down on the earth and rolled. They were egg-shaped, smooth. Their long sides were rimmed with pale white sand, glowing in the morning sun like the bones of a fish picked clean. Some held black still water. Some held thick stands of bay trees and cypress, dark green islands floating in fields of corn. Some had been drained by farmers and planted in rows, but you could still see their shape from above. Ghosts of a pattern the plow could not erase. And here was the thing that made a pilot rub his eyes and lean against the wind. They all pointed the same way. every single one, their long axes tilted toward the northwest, like a great flock of birds frozen in mid-flight. A field full of them looked like wind-blown wheat seen from a tower, like footprints from something walking in a straight line across the world. From ground level, you would never know. Standing in a tobacco field in Bladen County, you might notice the land dipped a little here, rose a little there. You might see a still pond in a hollow and call it a bay lake, the way your grandfather had called it. You might walk the sandy rim and not even know you were walking the edge of a circle the size of a small town. The bays hid themselves in plain sight. They were too big to see with 2 feet on the ground. It took the airplane to give them away. It took 10,000 feet of altitude and a pair of eyes squinting through goggles to see what had been waiting under the pines for longer than anyone could remember. The coastal plain stretches from southern New Jersey down through Virginia and the Carolinas and into Georgia and northern Florida. A long apron of sand and clay laid down by ancient seas, live oaks draped in Spanish moss, black water rivers that wind like coiled rope, heron and ibis wading in the shallows, and under all of it, scattered by the hundreds of thousands, these strange parallel ovals. In the 1930s, almost nobody knew they existed. The farmers knew the bays. The hunters knew the bays. The Lumbee and the Catawba and the PD had stories about the bays that went back further than any chapel bell. But nobody had ever stood high enough to see the pattern. Nobody had ever counted them. Nobody had ever asked the question that those first pilots brought home in their photographs. Why are they all pointing the same way? The first man to truly study the Carolina bays did not wear a lab coat. He wore canvas trousers stained with red clay and a wide felt hat that had seen 10 summers too many. His name was Frank Melton, and in the autumn of 1933, he was a geologist at the University of Oklahoma. He had soft eyes behind round glasses and a quiet way of speaking, the kind of man who would rather listen to a creak than to a crowded room. Frank had a friend named William Schriever. The two of them often sat together in small offices that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, leaning over photographs spread across wide oak Shriver was the dreamer of the pair. He had thick, dark hair he kept brushed back, and a habit of tapping his pencil against the desk when he was thinking. Melton was the patient one. He measured. He counted. He drew careful pencil lines across maps until the maps looked like spider silk. In those years, the United States government had begun something new. Pilots flew slow planes low over the southern states, snapping photographs of every field, every river, every patch of swamp. The pictures came back in stacks the size of bricks, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Most folks looked at them and saw nothing but farms. Melton looked at them and saw a riddle no one else had noticed. He started laying the photographs side by side, edge to edge, until the floor of his office looked like a quilt sewn from gray cotton. And there, across the cotton, were the ovals, hundreds of them, thousands, each one shaped like a soft egg pressed into the earth, each one tilted the same way, like compass needles drawn to a hidden north. Melton would kneel on that floor for hours. His knees ached, his back complained, but he kept measuring. He drew the long axis of one oval, then another, then another. He wrote the numbers in a small black notebook in tiny, careful handwriting, and every number told him the same thing. The ovals pointed northwest. Not most of them, all of them. Shriver would come in and stand in the doorway and shake his head. Shriver liked a puzzle that bit back. He would crouch beside Melton and run his finger along the edge of a bay on the photograph and say, soft and slow, that something had pressed these into the ground. Something big. Something that came from the sky. The two of them began to write. Their paper would not appear until 1933, and when it did, it landed in the world of geology like a stone in a still pond. They called the ovals the Carolina Bays. They reported that the bays were elliptical, that their rims were lifted slightly on the southeast side, that the soil inside was different from the soil outside, and that every last one of them aligned with the others, as if some giant hand had combed the coastal plain with a single sweep. Picture Melton in his office that first long winter. The radiator hisses. The window looks out on bare elm branches. A green-shaded lamp burns over the table, and the photographs glow under it like sheets of dim moonlight. He has a tin cup of coffee gone cold beside his elbow. He has a ruler, a protractor, and a pencil sharpened to a needle. He is 40 years old, and he is looking at something no human eye has ever seen all at once before. He knows it. You can almost feel him know it. Down in the Carolinas, the bays themselves slept on, as they had slept for 10,000 winters. Farmers walked the edges of them, hunting rabbits. Boys fished in the deeper ones for bream and bass. Old women picked gallberry and sweet bay along their rims. None of them knew that 2 men in Oklahoma were bent over photographs of their fields, tracing the shape of their world with trembling pencils, beginning to suspect that the soft hollow behind the corn crib was part of something vast. Melton would later say, in a letter to a colleague, that the bays had a kind of music to them. He meant the pattern. He meant the way they repeated, mile after mile, with the patience of a held breath. He could not stop thinking about them. He dreamed of them. He saw them when he closed his eyes at night. Faint gray ovals drifting across the dark, like leaves on slow water. All of them tilted the same gentle way. All of them pointing toward the same quiet horizon that no one had yet learned how to name. Long before any pilot ever looked down on the coastal plain from a small plane, long before any map showed the strange ovals stamped into the earth, there were people who lived among them. They walked the soft, sandy trails between the bays. They drank from the dark, tea-colored water. They knew every rim, every shallow, every quiet pool where the deer came to drink at dusk. The PD people lived along the slow brown rivers that wound through the pine flats. The Lumbee made their home in the swamp country, where the cypress trees stood with their knees in black water. The Catawba ranged west of them, the Waccamaw along the coast, and a dozen smaller tribes shared the low country with them all. Their lives moved in a slow circle, season after season, set by the rhythm of the land. In the spring, the women gathered the new green shoots along the bay edges. The men set fish traps in the shallow ovals, weaving them from river cane and tying them with bark cord. The children carried wooden bowls of crushed berries home through the pine straw. In the summer, the bays held back the heat. Their Their soft mud cooled the feet of anyone who waded in. Frogs sang from the reeds at twilight, and fireflies rose in soft green clouds above the still water. The bays were not strange to these people. The bays were home. They were the places where the duck nested in the tall grass. They were the places where the bear came to wallow in the cool mud on a hot day. They were the places where a hunter could sit at dawn and watch the mist rise off the water like slow breath from a sleeping giant. Every bay had a name, not the names you find on a map today. Older names. Names that meant the place where the cranes danced, or the water that holds the sky, or the long pond shaped like a leaf. The names told you what the place was. The names told you how to find your way through a country where the trails all looked the same, and the pines went on for 100 miles. In the long winter evenings, when the wind hissed through the dry needles, the old people told stories around the fire. The stories were not written down. They lived in the mouths of grandmothers and the ears of grandchildren, passed from one to the next like a small clay pot handed across the hearth. Some of those stories spoke of the bays themselves. One old story said the bays were the footprints of a great bird that had crossed the sky in the time before time. Each oval was where it had sat down to rest on its long flight. Another story said the bays were the marks of a giant who had walked the coast when the world was new, pressing the earth down with each slow step. Another spoke of arrows. Long ago, the story went, the sky people had hurled their arrows at the land, and where each arrow struck, a hollow was made, and the rain came to fill it. The stories did not all agree. They did not need to agree. They were not science, and they were not trying to be. They were a way of holding the strangeness of the land close, of making the strangeness feel like family. A child who heard the story of the great bird grew up looking at the bays a little differently. She saw a place where something old had touched the world and left its mark. Daily life moved on. The men returned from hunting with deer slung across their shoulders. The women smoked the meat over slow oak fires. The clay pots simmered with hominy and beans. Dogs slept under the eaves of the bark-roofed houses. Smoke curled up into the pine tops and drifted east toward the sea. In the morning, the people walked out to to the bay nearest the village to fetch water. The water came up dark, the color of strong tea, stained by the roots of the trees that grew along the edges. They drank it without worry. They had drunk this water for as long as anyone could remember. The bays sat where they had always sat. The oval shapes pointed where they had always pointed, though no one yet had a way of seeing them from above. From the ground, a bay was just a bay, a soft place, a wet place, a place to fish, to drink, to listen to the frogs at night. The mystery had not yet begun. The mystery was already there. It was simply waiting, sleeping in the soft sand under the bare feet of children, for someone to climb high enough into the sky to see it. The first English settlers reached the coastal plain of the Carolinas in the late 1600s. They came on small ships with salt-stained sails and tired horses. They came looking for land that could grow tobacco and corn and rice. What they found was a country that did not behave the way England had taught them. The ground here was strange. It looked flat from a wagon seat, but it was not flat at all. It dipped and rose in soft, shallow bowls, each one cradled by a low ring of pale sand. Inside the bowls, dark water gathered. Around the rims, trees grew thick and twisted, leaning over the water like old men bending to drink. The settlers had no word for what they saw, so they made one up. They called them Bay Lakes. The name came from the trees. Sweet Bay and Loblolly Bay grew along the edges, their leaves shining like polished green coins. The settlers knew bay trees from gardens back home, where a single sprig flavored a pot of stew. Here, the bay trees stood in whole forests, ringing each dark pool like a fence of living candles. A man could walk for a day and pass 100 of these bowls, each one wearing the same crown of bay leaves, each one holding the same black water that smelled faintly of tea. At first, the settlers thought little of them. The bays were just another odd feature of a strange new country, like the alligators in the rivers and the panthers in the canebrakes. The bowls held fish in the wet years and dried to soft black mud in the dry ones. The cattle grazed around them. Hunters waded into them after deer. Life went on. Then the small things started. a surveyor working near the Cape Fear River in 1730-something wrote a short note in his field book. He had laid his chain across the rim of a bay lake and tried to measure its long edge. The chain came out longer than he expected. He measured again and got a different number. He wrote that the ground itself seemed to pull at his compass needle, swinging it a few degrees off true north before settling back. He underlined the word seemed. Then he closed the book and never wrote of it again. A planter near the PD River told his neighbors that his hounds would not enter one particular bay. The dogs would chase a deer through pine woods for miles, baying loud enough to wake the dead. But when the deer crossed the sand rim of that bowl, the hounds stopped. They sat down on the white sand and whined. The planter would have to walk in and carry his deer out himself, the dogs watching him from the rim with low ears and lowered tails. A Scotch-Irish woman in the upper country told a story that got passed around for 3 generations. She had gone to one of the bays at dusk to gather bay leaves for her kitchen. The water was still. The frogs were quiet, which she thought was odd, because frogs were never quiet in those bowls at sundown. As she reached for a low branch, she heard something behind her. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound. A voice speaking words she almost understood. She turned and saw no one. The bay was empty. The water was smooth as poured glass. She walked home without her bay leaves and did not go back. These were small things: a swinging needle, a nervous dog, a wind that sounded like talking. The settlers were practical people with crops to plant and children to feed. And they did not write long books about such matters. But the stories gathered, the way leaves gather in the bottom of a still pool. A traveler passing through would hear 3 or 4 of them in a single evening at a tavern. The Bay Lakes, the locals would say. There's something about the Bay Lakes. A young Anglican minister riding circuit through the lowlands in 1740 wrote a letter to his bishop. He said he had baptized children in 5 settlements that month. He said the people were godly enough in their rough way. And then, almost as an afterthought, he wrote a single sentence near the end of the page. The lakes in this country are of a shape that no honest lake should have, and the the people speak of them with a quiet I cannot account for. He did not explain further. He sealed the letter and sent it across the ocean. And the bays kept their secret, lying in their pale rings of sand, waiting for someone who would finally ask the right question. The settlers who came to the Carolinas brought their own words for things, but the land already had a memory, and the trees that grew in those strange shallow ponds soon gave the places their name. Loblolly Bay, Sweet Bay, Red Bay, those broad-leaved trees with their waxy green shine and their small white flowers ringed the edges of the pools like patient watchers. The people noticed. They called the trees bays, and they called the ponds bays too. And after a while, nobody could quite remember which had come first. By the late 1700s, the word had stuck. A bay was a piece of land that held water and grew those particular trees. A bay was a hollow in the pine flats where the ground turned spongy and dark. A bay was something you walked around, not through, unless you had a good reason and dry boots and a long afternoon to spare. On Sunday mornings, after church let out, the old men would gather under the live oaks and trade what they knew. They knew the bays better than the preachers knew their scripture. One man would say his grandfather remembered a bay near the Lumber River that filled and emptied with no rain to speak of. Another would nod and say the same thing happened up by Elizabethtown, where a pond his uncle fished held bass one summer, and nothing but dry, cracked clay the next. The stories passed from porch to porch like a borrowed lantern. In the general stores, where the floors smelled of pine resin and molasses, and the barrels stood stacked against the walls, the talk got stranger after dark. A trapper would lean on the counter and tell about a bay he crossed at dusk, where the cypress knees rose from the water like a crowd of small kneeling men. He swore the wind moved through them without making a sound. The shopkeeper would laugh, but quietly, because he had heard the same kind of thing from a half-dozen other men, and they were not the sort to invent. The Lumbee people, whose families had walked that country long before the surveyors came, told the newcomers things that the newcomers half believed and half wrote down wrong. They said the bays were made when the sky bent low and touched the earth in a long said you could feel it in certain places, a kind of stillness that did not belong to the woods around it. They said the deer would not bed down inside the bays at certain times of year, and the dogs would circle the edges and refuse to step in. The PD elders had their own version. They spoke of a long ago hunt where the hunters chased a great white deer across the flatlands. Wherever the deer's hooves struck the soft ground, a pool opened up behind it, and the pools all pointed the way the deer had run. The hunters never caught the deer. They came home with empty quivers and a story their grandchildren would tell. When the settlers heard it, they shook their heads and laughed, and then that night lay awake and wondered. Down at the taverns, where the rum was cheap and the candles guttered against the smoke, the talk got bolder. A man named Hollies claimed his father had seen a light moving over Big Bay one winter night. A soft, round glow about the size of a dinner plate, drifting low over the cattails. The man said the light hovered, then sank, then vanished without a sound. Others nodded along. The bays had lights. Everyone knew that. The Singletary Lights, the Hickory Bay Lights, strange small fires that came when the air was heavy and the moon was new. The preachers warned against putting too much stock in such talk. They said the bays were just hollows, and the lights were just swamp gas, and the stories were just the leftover dreams of tired men. But even the preachers stepped careful when they crossed a bay road after dark. Even the preachers kept a salt pouch in their saddlebag. And so the word spread, slow and steady, the way moss spreads on the north side of a fence post. The bays were places. The bays were named. The trees that ringed them gave them their voice, and the people who lived among them gave them their stories. Nobody yet had thought to ask why so many of them lay in the same direction. All of them, every single one, like a great hand, had drawn them on the map with a single careful stroke. That question was still waiting. It would come soon enough. Somewhere in the records of eastern North Carolina, in a county where the soil runs black and the pines grow tall and the summer air hangs heavy as warm honey, there is a story about a farmer who tried to drain a Carolina bay. His name has been lost to time, the way most names are lost when 100 years pass. But his story has been told retold around kitchen tables and country store counters for so long that it feels true, even if the details have softened at the edges. He owned a piece of land somewhere south of the Cape Fear River. Sometime in the late 1800s, on that land sat one of the great oval depressions, a shallow bowl maybe a half-mile across, filled with black water and ringed by tupelo and bay trees. The locals called it a Poccasin, an old Algonquian word that means swamp on a hill. The farmer looked at that bowl of dark water and saw something different. He saw cotton. He saw corn. He saw rows of crops stretching across the rich peat soil that lay hidden beneath the shallow lake. So he set to work. He hired men with shovels and mules with sleds. He dug a long, straight ditch from the lowest edge of the bay down toward a creek that ran a quarter-mile away. The work took most of a summer. The men wore wide straw hats against the sun, and their backs glistened with sweat, and the mules snorted at the swarms of biting flies. When the ditch was finally finished, the farmer stood at the edge of the bay and watched the water begin to move. For 3 days, the bay drained. The level dropped slow and steady, like a bathtub with a small leak. The trees that had stood waist deep in dark water now showed their roots, twisted and gnarled and pale as old bones. The smell of wet peat rose up thick and sweet. The smell of leaves that had been rotting since before anyone could remember. And then the farmer noticed something. The bottom of the bay, once it began to show through, was not what he had expected. The soil, there was not the rich black loam he had dreamed of. It was peat, yes, but beneath the peat was a layer of pale sand, fine and white as sugar. And beneath that sand, when his men dug down, they found another layer of dark muck, and beneath that, more sand. The bay was built in layers, like a cake that had been sitting in the woods for ages no man could count. He planted his crops anyway. He drained the bay the rest of the way down. He plowed the soft black earth in long straight rows, and for one season it almost worked. The cotton came up green and tall. The corn stretched toward the sky. The farmer walked his rows in the cool of the morning and felt like a man who had outsmarted the land. Then the rains came. Not just rain, but the long, slow, soaking rains that fall on the coastal plain in late summer, the kind that drip from the eaves for days and turn every low place into a pond. The ditch could not carry the water away fast enough. The bay began to fill. The cotton drowned in standing water. The corn fell over in the soft, black mud. By the end of that fall, the bay had returned to exactly what it had been before. A shallow bowl of dark water ringed by bay trees, as if the farmer had never been there at all. The old people told that story for years. They told it as a warning. The bay, they said, remembers what it is. You can drain it for a season, but you cannot drain it forever. Something underneath wants it wet. Something underneath wants it to stay the shape it has always been. What the farmer did not know, what nobody knew yet in those days, was that the bay had been there for a very long time. Longer than the farms, longer than the towns, longer than the names the settlers had given the rivers, longer than the names the Lumbee and the Catawba and the Chera had given them before that. The bays were old, older than any story anyone had thought to tell about them. The indigenous people who lived along these coastal flats had their own quiet knowledge about these ovals in the land. They knew which ones held fish, which ones drew deer at dusk, which ones never dried even in the worst summer drought. They had walked among these bays for thousands of years, and somewhere in their old stories, passed down in the slow voice of grandparents, there were hints of how the bays had come to be. By the late 1800s, the bays had been part of Carolina life for as long as anyone could remember. Folks farmed around them. Hunters waded into them. Children swam in the ones that held water and picked blueberries from the ones that didn't. But almost nobody had tried to study them. They were just there, the way hills are there, the way rivers are there. You don't ask a river why it bends. Then a man named Lewis came walking down a sandy road in eastern North Carolina with a leather notebook tucked under his arm. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He was a naturalist, which in those days meant a man who loved the woods and wrote down what he saw in them. He wore a wool coat too heavy for the heat. His boots were caked with the pale clay of the coastal plain. He had a pencil behind one ear and a magnifying glass in his pocket, and He had spent the better part of a year walking from bay to bay across 3 counties. He had started simple. He wanted to map the plants. The bays grew strange things you couldn't find anywhere else nearby. Picture plants with hollow throats that drank rainwater and trapped flies. Sundews that glittered like beads of honey in the sun. Venus flytraps, those small green mouths with teeth like eyelashes, growing wild in the wet sand at the edges. Lewis sketched them all. He pressed leaves between sheets of brown paper. He filled page after page with careful drawings done in soft pencil. But the longer he walked, the more he noticed something the plants couldn't explain. Every bay he visited had the same shape. Not a circle, not a random puddle worn into the earth by rain. An oval, a long, smooth oval, narrower at one end, wider at the other, sitting in the flat pine country like a footprint pressed into wet clay. And every single one of them lay the same way on the ground. The long side ran from the northwest to the southeast, always, without fail. He thought at first he was imagining it, so he started measuring. He'd stand at the edge of a bay with a compass in his palm, the needle trembling under the glass. He'd write the numbers down. He'd pace the length, counting steps, and then pace the width. He'd note the height of the sandy rim that curled around the southeast end, like the lip of a teacup. He'd press his hand into the soft peat and feel how cold it stayed even on hot afternoons. Bay after bay, field after field, swamp after swamp. The numbers kept telling him the same thing. Northwest to southeast, northwest to southeast. The rim always raised on the same side. The water always pooled at the same end. It was as if some giant hand had stamped the whole countryside with the same wooden block, over and over again, while the earth was still soft. Lewis sat down one evening on the high sand rim of a bay near the PD River. The sun was sliding low through the longleaf pines, turning the trunks the color of old copper. The bay below him was a perfect oval mirror, holding the orange sky on its back. Frogs had begun their slow evening chant. Somewhere far off, a whippoorwill called twice and went quiet, and he wrote in that little notebook a sentence that would later be quoted in geology papers nobody at the time knew would exist. He wrote that the bays seemed to be the work of one event, one moment, something that had moved across the land from the northwest all at once and left these soft prints behind. He didn't know what could do such a thing. He admitted in the next line that he had no theory worth printing. Wind couldn't carve so cleanly. Water didn't lay things out in rows. Rivers wandered, but the bays did not. He closed the notebook. He walked home in the dark. For years after, Lewis showed his drawings to anyone who would look. Most people smiled politely. A few told him he was seeing patterns where there were none. The human mind, they said, loves to find order in chaos. The bays were just bays, old swamps, worn-down ponds, nothing more. But Lewis kept his notebook on his shelf, and every so often, when a young student came through asking about the strange ovals in the pinelands, he would pull it down, open it to the page with the compass, reading drawn in pencil, and tap the line that pointed northwest. He had no answer. He had only a direction, and a direction he believed was the beginning of every good question. For a long time, the bays kept their secret because nobody could see them. Walk through one on the ground, and you might not even know you were inside something shaped like an egg. The edges blend into pine flats. The water sits low, hidden by reeds and sweet bay trees. A farmer could plow the rim of a bay his whole life and never guess what shape his fields were tracing. The pattern needed a higher view. It needed someone in the sky. That someone came in the 1930s. The federal government had started a big project, sending small planes over the Carolinas with cameras strapped to their bellies. The goal was simple: map the land, photograph every acre so the soil men and the road men and the tax men would know what was down there. The planes flew slow and low, droning across the coastal plain like patient gray moths. The pilots wore leather caps and goggles. The cameras clicked once every few seconds, eating the land in long silver strips. One of the men who looked at those photos later told the story in his own quiet way. He said he had spread the prints across a long wooden table in a back room in Washington. The room smelled like dust and pipe smoke. came through a single window. He laid the strips edge to edge, the way you might lay out a puzzle, matching the trees and the rivers so the pieces fit. And then he stopped. He stood very still. He said his hand went cold around the magnifying glass. The whole land was full of ovals, not one or two, not a dozen, hundreds, thousands. They lay across the photographs like footprints pressed into wet clay. Some were small, no bigger than a barn. Others stretched a mile across. They overlapped each other in places, the big ones swallowing the small ones. The small ones nested inside the curves of the big ones like eggs in a basket. And every single one of them was tilted the same way. Long axis pointing northwest, short axis pointing northeast. Hundreds of thousands of perfect parallel ovals, all aimed at the same patch of sky. He said he sat down. He said he sat down for a long time. Then he called another man into the room, and that man also went quiet. They had been looking at this country their whole lives, and they had never seen it. Nobody had. The pattern was too big for human eyes on the ground. You had to climb up into the air to find it. A pilot who flew some of those early surveys told the story differently. He said he never noticed the bays while he was flying. He was busy watching his fuel gauge and his bearings, and the weather building up off the coast. But one evening, he came back to the airstrip, and the photo men were waiting for him with prints spread out on the hood of a truck. They pointed. He leaned in, and he said for a moment he forgot how to breathe. He said it looked like something had walked across the Carolinas in giant steps, leaving prints all aimed the same way. He said he flew the same country the next morning and tried to feel the shapes underneath him. He couldn't. The land hid them from the man inside it. A young geologist who saw the photographs later wrote about that night in his journal. He said the prints made him think of raindrops on a still pond, frozen in place. He said they made him think of the wakes that boats leave on a quiet lake, all pointing back to where the boat came from. He said he could not sleep for 2 nights. He kept getting up to look at the prints by lamplight. He said his wife asked him what was wrong, and he could not answer her because he did not have the words yet. That was the moment the mystery truly began. Before the airplane, the bays were just scattered ponds and swamps with local names: Singletary, Jerome, Big Bay, Black Lake. They were treated like accidents of the land, one here, one there. After the airplane, they became something else. They became a pattern, and a pattern means a cause. A pattern means something happened once, long ago, that touched the whole coast at the same moment and left the same mark over and over. The men around that wooden table did not know what the cause was. They only knew that the question had changed. It was no longer, "What is this pond?" It was, "What did this to all of them at once? And why are they all looking the same way?" The aerial photos sat on desks all across the East Coast in the late 1930s. Geologists passed them around like strange playing cards. Two men in particular could not stop looking. Their names were Frank Melton and William Schriever, and they taught at the University of Oklahoma. They had never set foot in a Carolina bay. They did not need to. The pictures told them something the ground had been hiding for thousands of years. Melton was a quiet man with round glasses and a careful way of speaking. Schriever was the kind of professor who covered his chalkboard in numbers until the dust hung in the air like fog. The two of them spread the photographs across a long wooden table in a sunlit office in Norman, Oklahoma. The light came through tall windows and fell on the prints in warm yellow squares. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the grass. Inside, the men leaned closer. What they saw stopped them cold. Not just one oval, not 10, hundreds, thousands, pressed into the coastal plain like footprints in soft clay. And every single one of those footprints pointed the same way. The long axis of each bay ran from the northwest down to the southeast, as if a giant hand had brushed the land in one long stroke. Melton tapped the photo with the tip of his pencil. He measured one bay, then another, then a third. The ratios matched, the shapes matched, the bearings matched. He moved to bays 100 miles apart, and still they matched. It was like finding the same fingerprint on 1,000 windows in 1,000 different towns. The two men began to talk in low voices. They talked about wind. Wind did not work. Wind on the coast blew from many directions across the seasons, not carve such clean ovals into the earth. They talked about waves. Waves did not work either. Most of these bays sat far from any ancient shoreline, tucked into the pine flats like sleeping cattle. They talked about sinkholes. Sinkholes were round, not oval, and they did not line up in formation like soldiers on parade. The longer they looked, the more the pieces seemed to rhyme. A bay in North Carolina had the same shape as a bay in South Carolina. A bay in Georgia had the same tilt as a bay in Virginia. The pattern stretched across state lines, across river systems, across forests and farms and forgotten roads. It did not care about any boundary humans had ever drawn. Schriever picked up a ruler. He drew lines through the long axis of each oval and extended them off the edge of the photographs. The lines did not stay parallel forever. They began to bend, slowly, gently, as if pulled toward a single point. And when he traced them far enough, those lines seemed to gather somewhere in the sky over the Great Lakes, somewhere up and to the northwest. The two geologists sat back. The room was still. The afternoon shadows had grown long across the table. Somewhere down the hallway, a clock ticked, slow and steady, the way old clocks do in old buildings. There was only one Force Melton, and Schriever could think of that might press a pattern like this into the ground. One force that came from the sky, one force that traveled in a straight line and struck a whole region at once. Something falling, something fast, something enormous. They began to write. The paper they would publish carried a careful, formal title, but the idea inside it was anything but careful. They argued that a swarm of objects had come down from the northwest, low and burning, and slammed into the soft coastal plain at a shallow angle. The shallow angle, they said, was why the marks were oval instead of round. A rock thrown straight down makes a circle. A rock thrown at a slant makes a streak. And streaks, when pressed into soft earth, look like ovals. It was a wild idea. Wild enough that other scientists laughed at first. Wild enough that the two men knew they would spend years defending it. But they also knew what they had seen. Photographs do not lie about geometry. Lines do not lie about direction. Whatever made the Carolina bays had moved through the sky in formation. And whatever it was had come from one place and one moment. The pattern was there. It had always been there. It had simply been too big for anyone to see from the ground. Two men in Oklahoma had finally tilted their heads back far enough to notice. And the sky, for the first time in thousands of years, seemed to be looking back. By the late 1930s, the idea was loose in the world, and it had a feel to it like nothing else in American science. The two geologists from South Carolina, Melton and Schriever, had taken those strange aerial photographs and laid them across their desks. They had measured the ovals with rulers and protractors. They had drawn lines along the long axes and watched, with a kind of held breath, as those lines all reached toward the same far point in the northwestern sky. And so they wrote it down. A swarm of objects, they said. A great rain of something from above. Bodies of ice or stone or both, falling in a long slanting volley out of the dark, striking the soft coastal plain at a shallow angle, and gouging the earth into shallow bowls. A comet, perhaps, broken into 1,000 glittering pieces before it reached the ground. You can picture how the theory must have felt to read in 1933. The country was deep in the Depression. The skies over the Carolinas were quiet, pale things, full of crop dusters and slow-moving clouds. And here were two careful men in tweed and wire glasses, saying that the ground under the tobacco fields had been carved by something falling out of heaven. The image is hard to shake once it enters you. Imagine the coastal plain as it might have looked long before any town stood there. A flat country of pine and grass and slow brown rivers. The sun setting low and red, and then from the northwest, a streak of white fire crossing the whole sky, splitting as it came, scattering into smaller flames like sparks blown off a hammered horseshoe. Each spark in this telling was a piece of a wandering thing. Some were no bigger than a wagon. Some were the size of a barn. They came in at an angle so shallow they almost skipped, the way a flat stone skips across a still pond at dusk. And where they touched, the soft, wet earth folded around them. The ground rose in a low, sandy lip on the downwind side. The bowl behind sank and filled slowly with rain and groundwater, until it became a quiet lake fringed with cypress and bay. That, the geologists said, was why the ovals were ovals and not circles. A straight-down hit would punch a round hole. A slanting hit would draw out a long teardrop, narrow at one end, wider at the other. And that, they said, was why every single bay, from the cornfields of Maryland down to the swamps of Georgia, pointed its long body toward the same patch of sky. The theory spread fast in the geology journals. It had the clean shape of a real answer. It explained the pattern. It explained the rims. It explained the parallel axes in a way no slow earthly process seemed to manage. For a stretch of years in the late 30s and through the 40s, the comet idea was the loudest voice in the room. Reporters loved it, of course. Newspapers ran little drawings of fiery streaks over palmetto trees. Sunday magazines printed maps of the bays, with arrows pointing back to some vanished place in the heavens. A few writers got carried away and put the date of the strike at the end of the last ice age, when the great mammoths still walked the river valleys, and the first people were just learning the land. The bays became, in the public mind, scars, old wounds in the country, soft green wounds, healed over with sweet bay leaves and white water lilies, but wounds all the same. And yet, even at the height of the comet years, a quieter voice was already pushing back. Other geologists looked at the same photographs and shook their heads. They asked the questions that have followed the theory ever since. Where was the iron? Where was the melted glass, the shocked quartz, the buried debris that any true impact ought to leave behind in the dirt? Why did the bays sit so shallow, so soft, with sides no steeper than a sleeping dog's back? A real comet shower, they said, should have left wreckage. The Carolina bays held water and peat and turtles. They did not hold the broken bones of a sky. So the comet theory took hold, but it did not hold alone. From its first telling, it had a shadow walking beside it, asking the hard questions in a low, steady voice. And that argument, born in those quiet pre-war years, would go on humming under the pines for the next 90 years. Never quite settled, never quite gone. The comet theory had a kind of music to it, a sky full of fire, a single moment that scarred the land in one perfect motion. For a while in the 1940s, it felt almost settled. Then the scientists started looking closer, and the music began to come apart. The first trouble came from the dirt itself. If a comet or a swarm of comets had struck the coastal plain, there should be something left behind. Bits of melted rock, tiny glass beads, strange metals that don't belong in Carolina soil, iron from somewhere far above the clouds. Researchers dug into the bay rims with shovels and screens and careful hands. They sifted the sand. They tested the clay. They sent samples to labs in distant cities. And what came back was ordinary. Just plain old Carolina earth, the same as the ground a mile away from any bay. That was the first thing that didn't fit. A cosmic strike that left no cosmic dust. The second problem was the shape of the bays themselves. If something fell from the sky and hit the ground, you'd expect a crater, a bowl with a raised rim all the way around, steep walls, a clear point of impact at the bottom. But the bays weren't bowls. They were shallow saucers, no deeper than a swimming pool, with soft, sloping floors and rims only on the southeast side. The northwest end faded gently into the surrounding land, like a footprint pressed by a giant who barely touched down. No crater shape, no melted glass at the bottom, no shattered bedrock, just sand and peat and water. The third puzzle was the age. Scientists pulled cores from the bay floors, long pencils of mud and peat going down through the years. They measured the layers. They counted backward. And the bays did not all seem to be the same age. Some looked young, only a few thousand years old. Some seemed far older. If a single great event had carved them all in one night, every bay should hold the same starting date. They didn't. The numbers scattered like buckshot across thousands and thousands of years. That was the detail nobody could explain. The detail that still sits in the middle of this whole story like a stone in a quiet pond. Because everything else about the bays whispered of one event. The matching shape, the parallel alignment, the way they all faced the same far horizon, as if every one of them had been combed by the same invisible hand. You could fly over the coastal plain and see the pattern with your own eyes, and your gut would tell you this was made in a single moment. Then you dig down into the soil, and the soil would tell you something else. The soil would tell you these holes had been forming and reforming and shifting for a very long time. The arguments started at conferences. Quiet men in wool suits raising their voices over slides and maps. One side held up photographs of the rims and the alignments and said, "Look at this. Look at how perfect it is. Nothing but the sky could do this." The other side held up the core samples and said, "Look at this. Look at the layers. Look at how the ages don't match." Both sides were standing on the same ground. Both sides were looking at the same bays, and neither could fully answer the other. Some scientists tried to bend the comet theory to fit. Maybe the impact happened long ago, they said, and the bays kept changing shape afterward, getting reworked by wind and rain over the centuries. Maybe the original meteorites had vanished into the soft, sandy ground, dissolved over time, leaving nothing for the shovels to find. Maybe the craters had been gentle to begin with, because the things that fell had been made mostly of ice. Others said no. The simpler answer was that the bays had nothing to do with the sky at all. The simpler answer was that the wind and the water had done all of it, slowly, patiently, over tens of thousands of years. And so, the great quiet pockmarks of the Carolinas became a quarrel. Not a loud quarrel, a patient, decades-long disagreement carried on in journals and lecture halls. The kind of argument that outlives the people who started it. One detail held the whole mystery in place. The alignment said sky. The soil said earth. And no one, in all the years of digging and measuring and flying overhead, has ever been able to make those two answers agree. The bays sit there still, holding their secret, pointing northwest at something nobody can quite name. Now you have to understand something about science. When a wild idea shows up, the careful people sharpen their pencils. They cross their arms. They ask hard questions. And in the case of the Carolina Bays, the careful people had plenty to ask. The Comet folks were out there talking about fireballs and chunks of ice falling from the heavens. Meanwhile, a quieter group of geologists looked at the same ovals and shook their heads. They saw something else entirely. They They saw wind. They saw water. They saw the slow, patient work of a flat coastal plain shaping itself over thousands of lazy years. Their argument went like this: the Carolina coast is old and it is soft. The soil is sandy. The water table sits close to the surface. In ages past, when the climate ran colder and drier, the winds blew long and steady across the open ground. A puddle would form in a shallow dip. The wind would push the water against one shore. Tiny waves would chew away at the bank. Sand would pile up on the downwind side. Slowly, over centuries, a round pond would stretch itself into an oval. The oval would point the way the wind pointed. And because the wind blew the same way over the whole region, every oval would line up like soldiers on parade. It was a beautiful idea in its own quiet way. No falling sky, no cosmic catastrophe, just sand and breeze and time. The skeptics pointed to the rim of pale sand that hugs the southeast edge of so many bays. That, they said, is exactly where wind-driven sand would settle. They pointed to ponds in Alaska, in Australia, in the high steppes of Asia, where shallow water shaped by wind had carved out oval basins that looked, in their own way, a little like the Carolina ovals. The process had a name. They called it thermokarst in some places, lacustrine drift in others. The words sounded heavy and respectable. They smelled of laboratories and not of legend. And the Wind and Water Camp had one more card to play. They looked at the dates. When geologists drilled into the bays and pulled up cores of dark peat, the layers of mud and plant matter inside told different ages in different bays. Some bays seemed old, some seemed young. Some had been refilled, dug out, and refilled again. If a single comet had carved them all in one terrible afternoon, the dates ought to match. The dates did not always match. That was a real problem for the Skyfire crowd, and the skeptics knew it. So, for decades, the wind and water idea sat comfortably in the textbooks. Most working geologists nodded along. The bays were strange, sure, but they were not mysterious. They were just slow, whether written into the ground. Yet, even the doubters had to admit there was a place where their story thinned out like fog burning off a field. The shape was the problem. can stretch a pond. Wind can pile sand. But wind, as far as anyone has measured it, does not carve a perfect ellipse with two clean focal points, as if drawn by a careful hand with a length of string. Wind makes messy ponds. It makes lopsided ponds. It makes ponds with ragged shores and uncertain edges. The Carolina bays are not messy. From the air, they look almost geometric, like the work of a patient artist who measured every curve. And there was the matter of the bays found on hilltops. Wind-driven water needs a low spot to gather. It needs a basin. Yet across the Carolinas and beyond, ovals turn up on rises and slopes where no shallow pond should ever have formed. The wind theory has no good answer for that. The doubters will scratch their chins and mutter about old terraces and lost drainage. The mystery sits unmoved. There is also the question of scale. Hundreds of thousands of these ovals, scattered across an area the size of several states, all oriented the same way, all shaped with the same elegant geometry, a single mechanism that's simple, working that uniformly across that much country for that long, without leaving a single bay that points the wrong direction. It is a tall order for any patient breeze. So the skeptics have their case, and it is a strong one. They have wind, they have water, they have time, they have other places on earth where the gentle erosion of shallow ponds carved soft ovals into soft ground. What they do not quite have is an explanation for how the Carolina bays became so perfect and so patterned and so stubbornly aimed at the same far horizon. There is a story they tell in the low country of South Carolina, in a stretch of pine flat between Florence and the coast. It is the kind of story passed across kitchen tables, never written down, never argued over, just held. The story belongs to a family named Ellerb, and it begins with a wagon, a mule, and a quiet stretch of ground that did not behave the way ground is supposed to behave. The year was somewhere near 1911. The wagon was loaded with cut timber. The mule was named Ruth, and the man holding the reins was a tenant farmer named Cal. He was crossing the edge of a shallow bay he had crossed 100 times. The bay was dry that summer. The reeds were brown and bent. The mud at the bottom looked as solid as packed clay. Ruth set one hoof in the soft center, and the ground opened like a mouth. That is how Cal told it, calm as Sunday morning, until the day he died. The mule went down to her chest. The wagon tipped, the timber slid, and Cal jumped clear into the brown reeds. He watched the bottom of his own world drink the front wheels of the wagon. Then the ground sighed, and the sighing made a sound like wet rope twisting under a porch. It took 6 men and a team of oxen the better part of a day to pull the wagon out. They never got Ruth out at all. By morning, the bay had closed over her back, soft and brown and patient, as if nothing had ever stood there. Cal walked the 4 miles home with the harness over his shoulder, and a look on his face that his wife said never quite left him. He told the story plain. He told it to the county agent, who wrote nothing down. He told it to the preacher, who said the Lord moved in strange ways through low places. He told it to a geology student from Columbia, who came around in 1937 with a clipboard and questions about the bays. The student wrote it down. The student also wrote in the margin that the witness seemed entirely sober and entirely sure. There are other families like the Ellerbs. There is a woman in Bladen County, North Carolina, whose grandfather lost a milk cow to a bay in 1924. There is a man in Horry County who watched his uncle's bird dog disappear into a patch of black water that had been pasture the week before. There is a Lumbee elder who tells of a hunter 2 generations back who knelt to drink at the rim of a bay and felt the sand under his knees begin to move like slow breathing. These people do not raise their voices. They do not write letters to the newspapers. They do not stand up at town meetings. They tell their stories the way you might describe weather or a recipe for cornbread, with the flat certainty of someone who has nothing to prove and nothing to sell. For a long time, scientists did not want these stories. The stories did not fit the wind and water theory. They did not fit the comet theory either. They suggested something stranger, something the geologists had no name for, that the bays were not finished, that under the peat and the cypress roots, something was still settling, still shifting, still hungry in the slow way that wet earth can be hungry. A professor from Duke came down in the 1950s to listen. He sat on porches. He drank sweet tea. He filled 3 notebooks with stories like Cal's. He never published any of it. His widow said, years later, that he believed every word he had been told. He simply could not find a way to fit those words into a paper that other professors would read without laughing. The people who told the stories did not seem to mind. They had not spoken to be believed. They had spoken because the bays had taken something from them, and naming the loss was the only way to live alongside it. Cal Ellerb lived to be 84. He kept a piece of Ruth's harness on a nail by his back door for the rest of his life. When his grandchildren asked about it, he would look out toward the dark line of pines that marked the edge of the bay, and he would say only that the ground out there was older than people, and that older things did not always agree to hold you up. Then he would close the door, and the wind would move through the longleaf pines, and the bay would sit in the distance, smooth and oval and quiet, the way it had always been. Down in the southeast corner of North Carolina, tucked between the green swamp and the slow brown coil of the Waccamaw River, there sits a lake that should not be there. It's wide and shallow and almost perfectly oval. The locals call it Lake Waccamaw. From a low-flying plane, it looks like someone pressed a giant thumb into the soft pine country and lifted it away clean. The long edge points northwest, just like all the others, but this one is different. This one is alive in a way the others are not. The water in Lake Waccamaw is the color of weak tea. That brown tint comes from tannins, the same stuff that stains a Cypress swamp dark as coffee. By every rule of nature, that water should be sour, acidic, almost too thin and bitter to hold much life. Yet, along the northern shore, there's a strange seam of crushed limestone hidden under the sand. That limestone bleeds into the lake and softens the acid. The water turns from sour to sweet, and creatures that should not survive there thrive. Biologists have a name for this. They call it endemic. It means the animals here live nowhere else on Earth. There's a fish called the Waccamaw killifish, a small flashing thing, no longer than your finger, with silver sides that catch the sun like a coin, spinning in shallow water. There's the Waccamaw silverside, slim and ghostly, swimming in soft schools just below the surface. There's the Waccamaw darter, which slips along the sandy bottom in the green shadow of underwater grass. There are snails too, tiny ones with delicate shells, found in this single oval pool of water, and absolutely nowhere else on the planet. Think about what that means. A creature evolves slowly across thousands and thousands of years. For these fish to belong only to this lake, the lake itself must be old. Older than most ponds, older than most streams, old enough to be a quiet little world all its own. Whatever made this depression in the ground gave the water time to fill, and the limestone time to bleed, and the small lives time to find their shape. And that depression points northwest, just like all the others. Walk the edge of Lake Waccamaw on a still morning, and you'll see the land remember things. The sand along the southeast rim is piled higher than the rest. It rises in a long, pale ridge, soft underfoot, the color of bleached bone. Pines grow on it in straight, tall rows, their needles the deep green of old velvet. On the opposite shore, the northwest side, the ground is flatter and lower and wetter. Cypress trees stand there with their knees poking up out of the water like little dark stumps. The lake breathes mist in the early hours, and the mist drifts in slow ribbons across the surface, always with the wind that comes off that higher ridge. The whole shape feels deliberate, as if someone designed it. There are other bays nearby: Singletary Lake, Jones Lake, White Lake, with water so clear you can see the white sand floor 12 feet down. Each one is a shallow oval. Each one points the same way. But only Waccamaw, with its hidden vein of limestone, became a nursery for things found nowhere else. The other bays hold their own quiet ecosystems. Peat bogs full of carnivorous plants, sundews glittering with sticky dew pitcher plants, standing tall as wine glasses, waiting for unlucky flies. In some bays, you can sink a fence post and never find solid ground. Farmers tell stories of trying to lay a foundation on the edge of a bay and watching it tilt by morning. The peat goes down 20 feet, 30 feet, sometimes more, soft and black and full of ancient pollen. Inside that peat scientists have pulled out grains from plants that vanished from the Carolinas long ago. Spruce, fir, trees that belong to colder places, frozen places, places where snow lasts half the year. Those grains are whispers from a different world. A world when the Carolinas were not warm and pine green, but cold and open and strange. The bays were there then. The bays held that pollen safe in their dark peat, like a library nobody bothered to read for 10,000 years. The land does not lie. The trees grew differently here. The water acts differently here. The fish exist nowhere else here. Whatever made these ovals long ago, the ground has not forgotten it. The shape is still there. The ridges still rise. The water still points northwest, and the small silver fish still swim in the only lake in the world that ever knew them. Down in Bladen County, North Carolina, there sits a quiet stretch of water called Singletary Lake. It is one of the Carolina bays. From the ground, it looks like any other dark lake, ringed by sand and shaded by tall pines. The water has a brown tint to it, the color of strong tea, stained by the tannins that leak out of fallen leaves. Spanish moss hangs from the cypress trees along its edge, swaying in the slow southern wind. But folks who have lived near Singletary for generations will tell you the lake holds something more than fish and lily pads. They will tell you about the lights. The stories go back at least to the early 1900s, maybe further. A fisherman would push his small wooden boat out across the water just after sundown. The sky still soft and pink at the edges. The frogs would start their evening chorus. The mosquitoes would rise in clouds. And then, out across the far end of the bay, a pale light would appear. Not a campfire, not a lantern, just a glow, hovering a few feet above the surface, drifting slow as a sleepwalker. Some said the light was blue. Others said it was the color of a buttery candle flame. It would float along the shoreline, dip toward the water, then rise again. If you tried to row toward it, it would slide away, always keeping the same distance, like a shy animal that wanted to be seen, but not touched. The old-timers had different names for it. Some called it the Bay Light. Some called it the Lantern Man. The Lumbee families in the area had their own word for such things, passed down through grandmothers who had watched these same waters for centuries. The light, they said, was old, older than the lake itself, older than the people who came to live beside it. What makes Singletary special is not that it has a ghost light. Plenty of American places have those. What makes it strange is that nearly every Carolina bay seems to have its own version of the story. Travel south to the bays of Horry County, and the folks there will tell you about the brown mountain lights of the swamps, glimmering above the still water on summer nights. Travel west toward the bays near Fayetteville, and you will hear stories about pale orbs that follow hunters home through the pine flats. The P.D. River country has its own tales. So does the country around White Lake, just a few miles from Singletary itself. The lights belong to a wider American tradition. They share a family with the Marfa lights of West Texas, where glowing balls dance across the desert flatlands, and have done so since the 1880s. They share something with the Hornet spook light of Missouri, a flickering thing that has rolled along a back road near the Oklahoma border for more than 100 years. They share something with the brown mountain lights of the Carolina foothills, which the Cherokee saw long before any settler wrote them down. Every one of these places sits on strange ground. Marfa rests on an ancient lake bed. Brown Mountain has unusual rock formations. The Hornet light glows above a road carved through old mining country, and the Carolina bays sit atop a coastal plain that geologists still cannot fully explain. People who study folklore have a name for these glows. They call them spook lights or ghost lights. Scientists who try to explain them away point to swamp gas, the slow burn of decaying plants giving off methane that catches a spark of static and flares for a moment in the dark. Others suggest tricks of distant headlights, bent and stretched by warm air over cool water. Others still talk about piezoelectric stress, where quartz grains buried deep in the soil release tiny flashes of light when the earth shifts. None of those answers ever quite satisfy the people who have seen the lights themselves, because the lights at Singletary do not flicker like swamp gas. They glide. They seem to watch. And here is the part that always pulls a listener back to the bigger mystery. The places in America where ghost lights appear most often happen to be places where the ground itself is unusual. Strange soils, strange shapes, strange histories nobody can quite explain. The Carolina bays are strange ground. Hundreds of thousands of them, all pointing the same way, all carved into the earth by some force long forgotten, and floating above them on certain quiet nights when the moon is thin and the air feels heavy as a wet blanket. The old lights still drift across the water, keeping a vigil over a mystery nobody has ever solved. Hunters have always known the bays in a way the scientists never could. They walked them in the blue hour before dawn. They sat in them long after the sun slid behind the pines. They carried home stories the rest of us only half believe, and sometimes they carried home small things too. Things you could turn over in your palm and wonder about. In the back rooms of old farmhouses across the Carolinas, you can still find them. A cigar box on a high shelf, a coffee can pushed behind the canning jars. Inside, the little artifacts the bays gave up. Pieces of dark, glassy stone, smooth as a river pebble, but heavier than it should be. Bits of fused sand, twisted into shapes that look like melted candle wax, frozen mid-drip. Old-timers called them sky stones. Their granddaddies called them thunder rocks. Nobody could quite say where they came from, only that they turned up in the bays after a hard rain washed the sand bare. One hunter near Elizabethtown kept a small jar of them on his kitchen windowsill. The morning sun would catch the glass and throw little green shadows on the wall. He told his grandchildren the stones sang at dusk if you held them up to your ear. They said it was just the wind in the pines, the long, slow breath of the swamp. He smiled and said the wind had to come from somewhere. There are photographs too, faded black and white snapshots from the 1940s, taken by men in canvas, hunting coats with deer slung over their shoulders. The men pose stiff and proud at the edge of some nameless bay. Behind them, the cypress trees rise like green cathedral columns. Look closer, though, at the corners of the picture. In more than a few of them, you can see strange ridges of pale sand rising out of the dark peat, curving away from the camera of a buried bowl. The hunters never mentioned the ridges. They were just there, part of the country, the way a hill is part of the country. Letters have survived. A school teacher named Eunice Hollings wrote her sister in 1938 about her husband, a quail hunter who came home pale one evening and would not eat his supper. He said he had been sitting on a stump at the edge of a bay near Bladenboro when a low hum started up under the ground. Not loud, soft as a beehive in another room. The dogs lay down flat and would not rise. The birds went quiet. Then it stopped, and the world started breathing again. He never went back to that particular bay. The letter is yellow now, the ink the color of weak tea, kept in a cedar drawer somewhere in Wilmington. Arrowheads turn up in the bays too, and that fact alone makes the story harder to dismiss. Long stone points, the kind archaeologists call Clovis, chipped by hands that walked North America more than 13,000 years ago. They lie scattered in the sand rims of the bays in numbers that no one can quite explain. Whole hunting camps, it seems, once gathered around these depressions. The people who shaped those points were there when the bays were younger, when something about them still mattered enough to draw the old hunters in. And then there are the rocks the geologists themselves carried home. Small samples sealed in paper envelopes, labeled in neat pencil, tucked into university drawers in Chapel Hill and Columbia. Magnetic spherules, no bigger than a grain of sand, pulled from the bottom of certain bays. Tiny black beads that a magnet will lift like iron filings. Some scientists shrug and say they are common, the dust of meteors that falls on every roof in the world. Others say there are too many of them, concentrated in the bay soils in numbers that ordinary skyfall cannot explain. The argument has gone on for decades, and the spherules sit quietly in their envelopes, waiting. You can hold these things. That is the strange part. The stones and the spherules and the arrowheads. You can lift the old photographs and feel the soft paper between your fingers. You can read the letters in your own slow voice. None of it proves anything, not on its own. A jar of dark glass might be old slag from a country forge. A hum in the ground might be a freight train miles away. A point in the sand might just be a point in the sand. But together, gathered in the back rooms of old houses, they make a kind of weight. A weight you can feel even when you cannot quite name it. There is a farm down in Bladen County, North Carolina, that has been in the same family for nearly 200 years. The land is flat and sandy, the soil pale as old bone where the plow turns it up. Longleaf pines stand in loose ranks at the edge of the fields, their needles brown and soft underfoot. And in the middle of one back pasture, hidden behind a curtain of sweet gum and bay laurel, sits a low oval of dark water. The family calls it the sister pond, though no one alive remembers why. The story goes like this. Sometime around the year 1840, the man who first cleared this land decided the pond had to go. It took up 2 good acres of bottom soil, and he wanted cotton there, not cattails. So he gathered his sons and his mules, and he set about draining it. They dug a long ditch from the low end of the bay out toward a creek a 1/4 mile away. They worked through the spring, sweating in the Carolina sun, their backs burning red beneath their shirts. By July, the water had drained off, and the floor of the bay lay exposed like a great brown plate. They burned the dead grass. They turned the black peat with a steel plow. They planted cotton in long, straight rows and waited for the bolls to come. The cotton came up sickly and thin. The leaves curled yellow at the edges. And then, the next winter, the water came back. Not slowly, not as a creep through the ditch. The family woke one morning in February and found the whole pasture covered 2 feet deep. The cotton stalks bent over like drowned hair. The ditch they had dug ran clear and dry. The water had risen from somewhere underneath. The man cursed and tried again. He dug deeper. He laid in clay tiles. He brought in a neighbor with a steam engine and pumped the bay down to bare mud for 3 summers running. Every winter the water returned, dark and cold and patient, as if it knew the way home better than he did. By the time he died, the family had given up. They let the bay be. They planted the high ground around it and called the wet center the sister pond, because his wife said it watched the house like a sister watching from the porch. That was 6 generations ago. The story has been told at every Christmas dinner since, and every telling has shaved a little off and added a little on. In one version, the original farmer saw a face in the water on the morning it returned. In another, an old Lumbee woman warned him before he ever lifted a shovel, told him the bay was a sleeping thing and didn't take kindly to being woken. The grandchildren swear she said it would never stay dry, not for any man, not for any plow. Some details have stayed firm across all the tellings. The ditch the family dug is still out there, half filled now with leaves and pine straw, running its straight line toward the creek. You can stand in it and see how deep they cut, how hard they worked. The clay tiles still surface sometimes when the tractor passes over the high ground, broken red curves of fired earth turning up like old pottery, and the water still comes and goes by some rhythm of its own, indifferent to drought and downpour alike. Geologists who have looked at the sister pond say it is a textbook Carolina Bay. Perfect oval, long axis pointing northwest like all the others. A sand rim curving along its southeast edge, soft and low. But there, if you know to look. Below the peat, they say, runs a layer of dense clay that holds water like a clay bowl. And beneath that, a shallow aquifer that breathes with the seasons. The bay refills, because the bay is the shape the ground wants to be in this place. The family nods politely when they hear this. They have heard scientists before. They have heard the Comet stories, and the wind and water stories, and the underground river stories. They have their own story, and it is older than any of them, and it goes like this. The land has a memory. The water knows where it has always been. You can dig, and you can drain, and you can plow. But the bay was here before your great-great-grandfather, and it will be here after your grandchildren are gone. And every winter, when the rains come heavy off the coast, the sister pond fills again. Dark, quiet, pointing northwest like a finger raised towards something on the horizon nobody can quite see. There is a stretch of land in eastern North Carolina that most people never see. It sits inside a fence line, behind warning signs, under the steady hum of military aircraft. The maps call it Dare County Bombing Range. For decades, pilots have flown low over these flat pine woods, dropping practice ordnance onto painted targets. The ground below them shakes. The herons rise from the marsh, and the bays, those quiet oval ponds, sit exactly where they have always sat. Something strange happened when the Air Force started photographing this land from above. The pictures came back, and the patterns were impossible to miss. Dozens of bays, then hundreds, all tilted the same way, all wearing the same soft elliptical shape, like fingerprints pressed into wet clay. The military was not looking for a mystery. They were looking for targets. But the targets were drawn on a landscape that already held a riddle older than the country itself. The story goes that one of the early survey pilots, a man stationed there in the 1950s, kept a folded copy of an aerial photograph in his footlocker. He showed it to his children years later, after he retired and moved to a little house outside Manteo. He would lay it flat on the kitchen table and trace the ovals with the tip of his finger. He told them the land down there remembered something. He did not know what, but he said you could feel it when you flew over. The way the air seemed to slow above those shallow ponds. The way the compass needle twitched a little when you crossed the rim of a big one. Maybe that's just a story a grandfather tells. Maybe the compass never twitched at all, but the photograph was real, and the pattern was real, and the bays were real, and the people who lived around the edges of that bombing range had been telling versions of the same story for generations. There is a small town not far from there. The houses sit low under the pines. The yards are sandy. In the front rooms, families keep old photographs on the walls, faded brown and curling at the corners. Pictures of grandfathers in overalls standing beside mules. Pictures of children in white Sunday clothes posed in front of a particular pond. One with cattails along its western edge and cypress knees on the far side. That pond is a Carolina bay. The family does not call it that. They call it the home water. They have called it the home water for 4 generations. A woman in that town, now in her 70s, tells visitors about the bay behind her father's old farm. She says her grandmother believed the bay was a kind of bowl that caught the sky. When it rained, the sky filled it up. When the sun came, the sky drank from it. She says her grandmother kept a tin cup on the back porch. And once a year, she would walk down to the bay at dawn dip the cup and drink. Not for any particular reason, just because her own mother had done it, and her mother before her. The woman does not know if the bays came from a comet. She does not know if they came from the wind. She has read the pamphlets. She has heard the arguments. None of it seems to touch the thing she actually knows, which is that her family has lived beside that water for over 100 years, and the water has shaped how they think about home. This is the quiet truth under all the science. Whatever made the bays made the people who live near them. They shaped where roads went. They shaped where farms could grow and where they could not. They shaped the names on the mailboxes and the stories the children heard at bedtime. They held the catfish and the cottonmouths and the wood ducks. They gave the bay trees a place to root. Inside the fence of the bombing range, the bays sit untouched. No farms now. No drainage ditches. No timber crews. Just the wide, flat woods and the painted targets and the ovals pressed into the earth like quiet thumbprints. In some strange way, the military closed off a piece of the old map and kept it the way it was. Outside the fence, the bays have been plowed and drained and forgotten. Inside, they remain. A pilot flying over at sunset still sees them. The light catches the standing water. The shape is unmistakable. Whether the mystery is cosmic or earthly, the land below has not stopped speaking. It is only that fewer people stand still long enough to listen. Step out into the field with me for a moment. Leave the porch light behind. Walk past the last fence post, past the slash pines, past the place where the gravel road turns to soft sand under your shoes. The night is warm. The air smells of pine sap and old water. Somewhere off to your left, a bay sits in the dark, holding its black mirror up to the sky. Stand still. Let your eyes find the stars. The Carolina coastal plain at night is a flat black sea. There are no mountains here to break the horizon. There are no city towers. Just the soft rise of the land, the dark crowns of the longleaf pines, and the wide bowl of the sky above you. The sky here feels bigger than it does in other places. It hangs low and close, like a great dark cloth pulled tight over the world. A whippoorwill calls from the tree line. Its voice rolls across the field, 3 soft notes, then quiet. A bullfrog answers from the bay. The water there is shallow and dark, and still as glass. Cypress knees rise from the edge like small wooden people. The Spanish moss hangs in long gray ropes from the oaks, and when the breeze moves, the moss sways the way seaweed sways in a slow tide. Now lift your face to the stars. Somewhere up there, the scientists say, the story began. Or maybe it did. 12,900 years ago, the world was leaving its last ice age. The great glaciers were melting. Mammoths still walked the plains. Saber cats still hunted in the canyons of the West. The first people in the Americas were already here, already telling stories around their fires. And then, in the span of one human lifetime, the climate snapped backward. The earth grew cold again. The glaciers paused their retreat. The mammoths vanished. A whole age ended in what felt like a single long winter. The scientists call that cold snap the younger Dryas. And some of them, the ones who believe the Comet story, say it began with a sky on fire. Picture it from where you are standing. Picture the same field, the same flat horizon, the same warm wind moving through the pines. Only the year is different. The people gathered here speak a language no one remembers. They are watching the sky. And the sky, they say, splits open. A streak of white light, then another, then 100. The horizon glows orange where there should be only darkness. The air shakes. The ground hums. Something enormous is coming apart in the upper air, scattering pieces of itself across the continent. That is the theory, anyway. A comet broken into 1,000 burning shards, raking the sky from the northwest. And the bays, all those quiet oval lakes around you, all pointing their long axes toward that same northwest horizon, are what those shards left behind. It is only a theory. Other scientists shake their heads. They say wind and water did this work slowly, over tens of thousands of years. They say the soil holds no melted glass, no shocked quartz, no proof of any skyborne fire. The argument is still going. The night does not care. Look back down at the bay. The water is so still it shows the stars on its surface. 2 skies, one above and one below, and you standing in the thin seam between them, pine cone drops somewhere in the dark with a soft thump. A barred owl calls, low and round. The cypress trees breathe out their cool, damp breath, and you can feel it on your skin like a held secret. The Carolinas at night feel old, not haunted, just old. The land here has been awake a long time. It has watched ice come and go. It has watched the sea climb up and crawl back. It has watched the first hunters cross its sand and the first farmers turn its soil and the first pilots cut their slow silver lines across its sky. Whatever made these bays, the land remembers. It just does not say, lie back if you like. The sand is soft. The grass is warm from the day. Let your head rest against the earth, and let the stars hold their place above you. The Milky Way runs from pine top to pine top like a river of milk and dust. Satellites drift through. A meteor flicks across the corner of your eye and is gone. You are very small here. You are very safe. The bay sleeps beside you, and the sky watches over both of you, and the mystery for tonight is content to wait. Walk the edge of a Carolina bay on a soft autumn afternoon, and you will feel the ground change under your boots. The wet, dark center gives way to something paler. The soil grows lighter, drier, finer. Then your foot lifts a little higher than you expected, and you realize you are climbing. Not much, just a gentle swell, maybe 4 or 5 feet above the surrounding plain. You have stepped onto the sand rim. The sand rim is the bay's quiet signature. It curves around the southeastern edge of nearly every bay like a low, pale eyebrow drawn on the land. From above, it looks like a half-moon of bone-colored earth pressed against the dark green oval. From the ground, it feels like nothing at all. A rise, a change in the trees, a different kind of dirt under your shoes. But that low ridge of sand is the reason the story keeps living. In the small towns of eastern North and South Carolina, the people who grew up near these bays learned about the rims before they learned what the rims meant. Farmers knew the sand on the southeast side drained fast. The grandparents planted peach trees and watermelon there because the roots loved that loose, bright soil. They planted corn down in the bay flats where the ground stayed damp. The shape of the land told them what to do, even if they could not name the shape from above. Children grew up playing on the rims without knowing they were playing on a buried story. They rode bikes along curving sand paths that followed an arc nobody had drawn on purpose. They built forts in the longleaf pines that grew tall and thin in that sandy soil. They picked the small wild blueberries that loved the dry rim and the carnivorous pitcher plants that loved the wet middle. Two different worlds, 3 steps apart. Towns took their names from the bays without always knowing why. Bayborough, White Lake, Lake Waccamaw, Singletary. The word bay itself slipped into everyday speech down there in a way it does nowhere else in the country. A bay is not water in Eastern Carolina. A bay is a place. A bay is a kind of ground. A bay is a hollow in the pines where the deer go at dusk and the fog gathers at dawn. That language is its own quiet inheritance. A boy in Bladen County can tell you he hunts the bay edges in November, and a stranger from anywhere else will picture an ocean inlet. The boy means something nobody outside those counties quite understands. He means the soft oval of Cypress and Tati. He means the sand rim that holds the deer trails. He means a shape on the land that has been there since before the first people walked across it. Every fall, a few of the small towns hold festivals near the larger bays. There are fish fries at White Lake, boat parades at Lake Waccamaw, quiet little fairs in churchyards where someone sells honey gathered from bees that worked the wildflowers on a sand rim. The festivals do not always mention the mystery. They do not need to. The mystery is the reason the lake is shaped that way. The mystery is the reason the soil grows what it grows. The mystery sits under everything like a sleeping animal nobody bothers to wake. The pilots who fly small planes out of Florence and Fayetteville will tell you they still notice the bays every time they go up. Once you have seen the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The whole coastal plain becomes a page of ovals, each one aimed at the same far horizon, each one ringed by that pale crescent of sand on its southeast shoulder. Pilots point them out to their passengers. Teachers fly their students over them on field trips. The pattern has become a kind of regional secret hiding in plain sight, and the sand rims keep their counsel. They are made of grains so fine and pale they almost glow at sunset. Some scientists believe the wind piled those grains there over thousands of cold, dry years. Others believe a great shaking of the earth flung the sand outward in a single afternoon. The grains themselves do not say. They only lie there, curved and patient, holding the shape of whatever happened. The people who live there have made peace with that silence. They walk the rims. They plant the rims. They name their children after the lakes that sit inside the rims. They have built a whole soft culture around a question nobody can answer. And somehow the question has become the answer. For a long time, people thought the bays belonged only to the Carolinas. That was where the name was born, after all. Cypress Bay, Loblolly Bay, Sweet Bay. The ovals were stitched into the soft coastal plain like quiet thumbprints pressed into clay. And anyone who studied them assumed the story ended somewhere south of Virginia and north of Georgia, tucked between the pines and the long flat reach of the sea. Then came a woman named Ella Me Carter, though that name has shifted a little in the telling. She grew up in Bladen County, North Carolina, the granddaughter of a turpentine man. As a girl, she walked the rims of the bays with her grandfather, gathering pine straw and listening to him talk about the sky. He told her the depressions were old wounds, places where something fell long ago, and the land never quite healed. She kept that idea folded inside her like a pressed flower, and she carried it with her when she left the South. Ella Me moved north in the late 1950s, chasing work and a quieter life. She settled on the eastern shore of Maryland, in a low country of tidal creeks and salt marsh. The land there felt familiar in a way she could not name. Flat, sandy, stitched with shallow ponds that filled in the spring and dried by August. One afternoon, she walked out past the soybean fields behind her house and stopped cold. The pond at the edge of the woods was an oval. The long axis pointed northwest, the same direction her grandfather had taught her to watch as a child. She wrote letters. She wrote to a state geologist in Annapolis. She wrote to a professor at the university in College Park. She drew careful maps in pencil, marked the ponds she had found, and posted them in plain envelopes with 12 12-cent stamps. Most of those letters went unanswered. One came back with a polite note saying the ponds were probably just shallow basins shaped by ice and wind during the last cold age. The professor thanked her for her interest. He did not visit. Ella-Mee kept walking. She found more ovals on the Delmarva Peninsula, dozens of them, hiding in plain sight under cornfields and chicken farms. Some were so worn down, you could only see them when the light came at a low angle. Others held water all year and rang with frogs at dusk. The locals called them whale wallows, a strange name nobody could quite explain. Old stories said a great whale had once thrashed across the land before the sea pulled back. Ella-Mee loved that story. It reminded her of her grandfather and the sky. Years later, geologists would catch up to her. They would confirm what she already knew, that the Carolina bays were not only Carolinian. The same ovals appear in Maryland, in Delaware, in southern New Jersey, in eastern Virginia, scattered up the coastal plain like seeds blown from one hand. Some have been found as far inland as Nebraska, though those are contested, and the pointing is harder to read. The ones on Delmarva, though, are clear as printed letters. They line up northwest, just like their southern cousins, as if the same hand drew them all. Ella-Mee lived long enough to see a LiDAR map of the eastern shore. A neighbor's grandson brought it over on a laptop, and she sat at her kitchen table with the screen glowing pale against the wallpaper. The ovals jumped out of the ground like ghosts, finally allowed to speak. She traced them with her finger and did not say much. She had carried the story north 50 years before any official map agreed with her. Stories travel like that. They ride in suitcases. They sit in the back of pickup trucks. They settle into new soil and wait for someone to notice. The bays themselves never moved, of course. They have been where they are since long before any of us had names. But the knowing of them, the seeing of them, that part has wandered. It walked north with a turpentine man's granddaughter. It rode west with surveyors and soldiers and farmers chasing better dirt. It slipped into letters and lectures and quiet kitchen conversations. Somewhere in Nebraska, a rancher looks at a strange shallow pond in his pasture and wonders why it always fills from the same side. Somewhere in Kansas, a pilot banks her small plane and sees an oval she cannot explain. The story keeps finding new mouths. The mystery keeps finding new ground. And the ovals, wherever they sleep, keep pointing the same patient way. Somewhere in a quiet lab, in a building that smells like old paper and metal shelves, there is a long wooden drawer. Inside that drawer are tubes of dirt. Each tube holds a slim column of soil pulled up from the bottom of a Carolina bay. The columns are layered like a cake, dark at the top, pale in the middle, rust-colored near the bottom. To most people, they look like nothing. To the scientists who study them, they are pages in a book nobody has finished reading. The cores come from bays all across the coastal plain. Some were pulled from sandy edges in South Carolina. Some came up from black peat in North Carolina. Some were drilled in fields that look like nothing more than damp pasture. Each core holds tiny grains of pollen, bits of charcoal, flecks of mineral. And now and then, a strange little bead of glass. Those glass beads are the part that keeps people awake at night. The beads are small, smaller than a grain of rice. Some look like dark teardrops. Some look like frosted marbles. Scientists call them spherules. They form when something gets very hot very fast. Hot enough to melt sand into liquid and freeze it again in midair. You find them around old volcanoes. You find them around meteor craters. And according to some researchers, you find them in the soil of certain Carolina bays at one particular depth, in one particular layer, dated to one particular moment in time. That moment is about 12,800 years ago. The same moment some scientists believe a comet broke apart over North America. The same moment the younger Dryas cold snap began. The same moment the mammoths and the saber cats and the giant ground sloths started to vanish from the land. The cores hold other clues too. There are thin black lines of charcoal that suggest enormous fires burned across the continent. There are spikes of strange metals like platinum and iridium, metals that are rare on Earth but common in space rocks. There are tiny diamonds, so small you would never see them without a microscope, the kind that form only under under sudden pressure. The believers look at these cores and feel certain the story is written right there in the dirt, they say. Read the layers like rings on a tree. Something fell from the sky. Something burned. Something changed the world. The skeptics look at the same cores and shake their heads. The beads could be ordinary. The charcoal could be from regular wildfires. The metals could have washed in from somewhere else. And the bays themselves, they argue, may be far older than that 12,000-year mark. Some cores show layers of sediment going back hundreds of thousands of years, layers that built up slowly, season by season, while the bays simply sat there gathering rain. So the soil cores whisper. They do not shout. They give a little piece of an answer and then take it back. They show you a bead of glass and then a layer of plain old mud. They are a story told in a language we are still learning to read. Out in the bays themselves, the work goes on. Researchers walk the rims in tall rubber boots. They drive narrow tubes into the soft black earth. They cap the tubes and label them and carry them back to the trucks. The bays watch all of this with the patient stillness they have always had. The water sits dark and quiet. The cypress trees lean over the edges. The bay magnolias bloom in the spring and drop their thick white petals into the still water. Above the bays, the satellites keep mapping. The LiDAR keeps stripping away the trees. Every year, new bays appear on the screen, bays that no one had counted before, hidden under farms and forests and forgotten roads. The number climbs. 500,000, 600,000, maybe more, each one a soft oval, each one pointing the same way, each one waiting, and the question stays open. Did a great fire come down from the sky and pock the land with burning stones? Did the wind and the water carve these shapes patiently over 100,000 winters? Did something happen we have not even thought of yet? Something so old and strange the words for it have not been invented. The soil cores will not say. They whisper, and the whisper sounds different to every ear that listens. Some hear a comet. Some hear a slow drumbeat of seasons. Some hear nothing at all, just the quiet ticking of time inside the dirt. The drawer slides shut. The lab grows dim. And out on the coastal plain, the bays sleep on. And so we come back from the high cold sky of the younger Dryas, back from the comet fields and the wind theories, back from the LiDAR maps glowing on quiet computer screens, back from the soil cores and the sand rims and the bay lakes that hold their secrets like cupped hands, back to here, to the pines, to the slow Carolina night. Picture it now, the way it looks when no one is watching. A wide, flat country stretching from Virginia down through the low coastal plain, soft as an old quilt thrown across a sleeping body. The pines stand tall and dark, their long needles whispering when the breeze moves through them. The air smells of resin and damp earth. Somewhere, a screech owl calls once, and the silence folds back over the sound like water closing over a stone. Down in the bays themselves, the water is still, black as ink in the moonlight, smooth as glass. Cypress knees rise from the shallows like the knuckles of something old and patient. Spanish moss hangs in silver curtains, swaying just barely, as if breathing in its sleep. A single bullfrog speaks from the reeds, deep and slow, and then quiet again. Above all of it, the sky turns. The stars wheel the way they have always turned, the way they turned 12,000 years ago, when something, perhaps, came roaring out of the dark, or when the winds began to whisper across the shallow ponds. Year after year, century after century, carving the ovals we still cannot fully explain. This is the thing about the Carolina Bays. They do not need us to look at them. They do not need our theories, or our maps, or our arguments. They have been here, lying in their long pointing rows, since before any human walked these woods. They will be here long after the last theory is written down and forgotten. The Lumbee told stories about them. The PD told stories about them. The settlers told stories about them. The pilots in the 1930s flew over and saw the pattern and told a new story. The geologists added their voices. The comet hunters added theirs. The LiDAR specialists are adding theirs right now, in offices lit by pale screens, finding bays where no one knew bays existed. The story keeps going. That is what stories do. They do not end. They get passed from one mouth to another, one notebook to another, one tired traveler to another, around fires like this one, in rooms like this one, in the soft dark just before sleep. Maybe a comet did break apart above the northern ice and rain its pieces down across half a continent. Maybe the wind and the water, given enough time, can carve 250,000 ovals, all pointing to the same lost horizon. Maybe it was something else entirely, something no one has thought of yet, waiting in the peat and the pollen and the buried sand for someone clever enough or patient enough to listen. For now, the bays sleep. Lake Waccamaw rests in its bed of